Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors Revenge, where quiet people finally say the things that took years to say, and families learn what presence actually means. If stories like this tend to find you at the right time, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. I want to start with the smell, because smell is the one thing you can't fake. Rain on hot asphalt. And underneath it, faint but unmistakable, my sister's shampoo, the same drugstore bottle she'd used since we were kids, green apple on the label, a scent I would know blindfolded in a room full of strangers. That's what reached me first when I finally opened the door to her after 2 years of silence. Not her face. The smell. The face arrived a half-second later, and by then my body had already made a decision my mind hadn't caught up to yet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I always do this, start in the middle, because the middle is where the feeling lives, and then have to circle back and lay the numbers down in order, because without the order, none of it means anything. That's the accountant in me talking. Or maybe the accountant is just the version of me that got to the wheel first and never handed it back. This story starts with the best news of my entire life. And it took exactly 3 weeks for my family to turn that news into a waiting room. So let me take you back to the April everything started, because you deserve the itemized version, not the highlight reel. My name is Noor Kestrel. I'm 31 years old. For 6 years I worked as a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm in Denver called Halloran & Vance, 3rd floor, a window overlooking a parking structure whose shift change patterns I could recite from memory by year 3. It isn't a glamorous job, whatever television has told you. Nobody kicks down doors. Mostly it's a Tuesday afternoon and a stack of general ledgers that some quiet bookkeeper has been bleeding for 18 months, and your job is to find the bleed before the company does, or prove to a judge, beyond reasonable doubt, that the bleed exists at all. It rewards a specific kind of patience, the belief that a lie, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves a mark somewhere in the paper, if you're careful and humble enough to read the same 11-line invoice for the 14th time. I was good at it. I am good at it. It took me until my late 20s to understand that it was the only language my family had ever taught me fluently, not love, exactly, and not attention, but find the discrepancy. That's a strange thing for a household to teach a child by accident. But it's the only thing a house like ours could ever have taught, given what it was actually built to run on. I have one sister. Wren. 3 years older than me. And where I was built for columns and reconciliations, Wren was built for rooms. She could walk into one, a birthday party, a church basement, a hospital waiting area, and rearrange the air pressure in it simply by existing at its center. Our mother, who spent 22 years as a hospice chaplain, used to call this a gift for presence. She said it warmly, the way you'd describe a talent for piano. What she actually meant, though I don't think she'd have admitted it under oath, was that Wren had a gift for becoming the emergency. And our house, like a lot of houses that run on someone's crisis training, had a built-in reflex for locating the emergency and pouring itself toward it, every single time, without asking questions. I found this out early, the way children find out most of the things that matter, not by being told, but through the slow accumulation of small, specific absences. I have a memory. I was 7. I'd won a regional spelling bee, the word was desiccate, and I remember that detail with an embarrassing clarity, the way you remember the trivial thing that was happening the moment something larger happened around it, and I came home high on the win, certificate rolled tight in my fist like a diploma, rehearsing in the back seat exactly how I'd present it at the door. The house was dark. My mother's car was gone. Wren had fainted at cheer practice, nothing serious, as it turned out. Low blood sugar and a growth spurt colliding in a gymnasium that ran 12 degrees too hot, but by the time everyone reconvened at our kitchen table that night, it was past 11, and my certificate had been quietly relocated at some point during the crisis from the refrigerator door to a shelf in the den, where it survived for roughly a week before it simply stopped existing. Nobody threw it away in front of me. Nobody said a single cruel word about it. It just stopped being there. The way small things do in houses where there's always a bigger thing. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for a 7-year-old with a spelling trophy. Plenty of kids lose a moment to a sibling's crisis and grow up perfectly fine. I'm telling you because it's the first entry in a ledger I didn't know, for another 22 years, that I had already started keeping. There were more entries, if you want the itemized version. And I think you do, because I don't think this story makes any sense without them. There was the time Wren, at 14, came down with a stomach flu during the exact week of my elementary school science fair, and my project, a working model of a hydroelectric dam that had taken my father 3 weekends of garage time to help me build, sat unpresented on a folding table in the gymnasium, because both of my parents were at urgent care with her, and a teacher I barely knew drove me home instead. There was the year I made varsity tennis, my junior year, and Wren, a senior that same season, developed something her doctor called stress-related vertigo, requiring someone to walk her to and from every class for a month, a rotation my mother organized with the crisp efficiency of a small logistics company. There was Wren's engagement, 3 full years before any of the rest of this happened, to a man named Desmond, who sold commercial real estate and had a laugh you could hear through 2 closed doors, announced at my own birthday dinner, mid-cake, mid-candle blow, the whole table's attention swinging toward her like a compass needle finding true north. I didn't resent it in the moment. I want to be honest about that. I clapped. I hugged her. Some part of me had already learned, by then, that resentment was an expensive thing to feel out loud in that house, and I had decided, somewhere around 18, to simply stop affording it. That was also the year I moved out. 18, a dorm room financed by a patchwork of loans and a job at the campus copy center, and nobody told me to leave. I left because I'd worked out that there was a pattern in that house, and the pattern had a shape, and the shape had no room in it for a second person who needed things. So I became the other kind of daughter. The one who needed nothing. I called every Sunday at 6 exactly, brought a salad to every family dinner, left before the dishes could turn into a conversation, paid my own tuition, my own rent, my own everything, and some part of me, I can admit now with distance, enjoyed the cleanliness of it. If you never ask anyone to catch you, nobody can drop you. That's a kind of safety. It's just not the kind that keeps you warm at night. Fast forward 13 years. I'm 29. 6 of those years spent at Halloran and Vance, and most of the nights and weekends of the last 2 spent studying for the admissions exam for a fraud examination master's program at a university in Chicago, small, fully funded, brutally competitive, the kind of program that reshapes a career instead of merely extending it. I applied to exactly one school, because application fees are real money when you're the only person paying your own rent. And in March, standing in a parking garage on my lunch break, I opened the email on my phone. Admitted. Full funding, plus a research stipend. I read it 4 times, right there between a concrete pillar and a stalled minivan. I made a sound I would absolutely dispute under oath. I drove back to the office and sat in my car for another 10 minutes before I trusted my own face enough to go back inside, and that night I printed the offer letter on the good printer at work, the one that didn't leave a faint gray banding down the page, and taped it to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tiny adding machine, a gag gift a coworker had given me 2 Christmases earlier. I stood in my kitchen and looked at that letter the way, I imagine, other people look at ultrasound photos. And here is the thing I need you to understand about me, because it tells you everything about the house I came from. My very first thought, before the joy had even finished landing in my chest, was how do I announce this without causing trouble? I drafted the wording in my head like a legal disclosure. Understated. Low-key. A fact delivered with its own fire extinguisher standing beside it, just in case. I announced it at Sunday dinner 3 weeks later, in the tone I'd rehearsed the entire drive over. Grad school. Chicago. Full funding. And for about 15 minutes, I know it was 15 minutes, because I've replayed that dinner enough times to time it with a stopwatch, it was wonderful. My father, a man who fixes small engines for a living and treats sentences like a resource to be rationed, got up from the table and hugged me with grease still faintly under his fingernails and said, "First one of us with a graduate degree," twice, like he was test driving the sentence out loud before he let himself fully believe it. My mother cried a little and asked practical questions: housing, health insurance, how far from the nearest hospital, a hospice chaplain's version of small talk. 15 minutes. The turn always comes at the same spot, no matter how many times I replay it. My mother reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "You always land on your feet." She meant it as praise. I filed it as praise for years. It would take me most of another year to hear what it actually was, a license. Paperwork you sign the moment you've quietly decided somebody doesn't need catching, so that your hands stay free for whoever does. Across the table, Wren had gone quiet. Genuinely, unusually quiet. She'd said congratulations at the right beat, hugged me at the right angle, and then spent the rest of the meal with both hands wrapped around her water glass like she was trying to stay warm inside a heated house. I noticed. Noticing is my one marketable skill. I told myself she and Desmond had probably fought in the car. 17 days later, she called a family meeting of her own. She sat us down on a Wednesday evening, in the good living room, reserved for funerals, Christmas photos, and, apparently, this, instead of the kitchen, which in our family has always marked the line between a private conversation and an address delivered to a small nation. Desmond stood behind her chair, both hands on her shoulders, posed like a photograph he already knew would matter later. Wren looked around at the four of us and said she'd been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive autoimmune condition. She said its name. I won't reproduce it here, because it's a real condition that real people genuinely suffer through, without a single stumble, in the polished cadence of someone who has rehearsed a thing enough times that the words have worn smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket for months. 18 months, maybe 2 years, she said, if a newer infusion protocol responded well. She said it dry-eyed, brave, right up until the exact second my mother reached her, and then the two of them folded together onto the carpet, and my father stood turning his reading glasses over and over in his hands, and I sat frozen in an armchair while grief and something else fought inside me, and I hated myself for the something else. Because even in that first hour, and I need you to know this, because it's the ugliest true thing in this entire story, small details were already snagging on me the way a bad invoice snags on a careful reader. She had a treatment plan ready before anyone had asked a single question about one. She had the name of a clinic. She had numbers, survival percentages, response rates, recited with a fluency that struck me, even through my own tears, as belonging to someone who reads far more than she needs to for a diagnosis she'd supposedly just received. Real news, in my professional experience, arrives ragged. It has gaps. People say I don't know yet a lot, because they genuinely don't. Wren's story had no gaps. It had already been edited for broadcast. I strangled that thought in the crib, immediately, violently. What kind of person audits her own dying sister's diagnosis in the middle of the announcement? By that same night, my mother had a legal pad out on the kitchen counter, building the thing she builds better than anyone I have ever met, a care plan. Appointments, medication windows, insurance calls, meal rotations. And I watched my own name get written into it in my mother's handwriting before anyone had asked me a single question about my availability. Noor, Wednesdays. Flexible, hasn't started school yet. That last clause was spoken out loud, in front of me, in the tone reserved for settled matters. Not a request. A line item. I want to be fair to myself here, because it would be easy, telling this story, to make myself sound either like a saint or like a woman who arrived pre-suspicious and simply waited to be proven right. I was neither. I tried, genuinely and desperately, to do this the correct way. I asked to come to one appointment, just to sit in the waiting room, just to hold her coat while she went back. I need one thing that's only mine, Wren said, eyes bright with tears I fully believed, at the time, were completely real. And what kind of monster argues with that? I asked for her oncologist's name, so my mother could help coordinate records. He's at a private center out past Laramie. I'll text you the info. The text never arrived, and asking twice felt, in the moment, like an accusation I wasn't ready to make yet. I offered to handle her insurance paperwork. I do this professionally, it would have taken a weekend. The clinic's social work team handles all of it, Noor. Please stop trying to manage my cancer. The word manage landed exactly where she meant it to land. Every door I knocked on closed with perfect medical manners, in a vocabulary she'd absorbed from a household full of health professionals. You cannot subpoena your own sister. Thanks to privacy law, you cannot call a clinic and ask whether a named person is even a patient there. Those walls exist for good reasons. They also, I would learn, work perfectly well for other purposes entirely. So I did the only thing left to me. I called the graduate program's admissions office and asked about deferral. 1 year, they told me, granted only for documented family emergencies, and only once. The school does not defer twice. After that, you reapply from zero, and the funding is not guaranteed to follow. I remember the admissions coordinator's voice on the phone, kind, and completely final, the exact tone my mother used for the care plan. I signed the deferral form at my kitchen counter, underneath the acceptance letter still taped to my refrigerator, my little adding machine magnet holding it flat while I postponed a year of my one life for a disease I would spend the entire year quietly failing to find. The year found its rhythm fast, the way disasters do once you stop fighting their shape and start scheduling around it. Wednesdays were mine. I'd pick Wren up at 9, drive her 40 minutes to the infusion clinic, and drop her at the main entrance, because she was firm about that particular detail, almost fierce. Don't park. Don't wait. Infusions run 4-5 hours, and I don't want you watching me come out weak. It sounded like dignity. It read as dignity for months. Her head was shaved by then, she'd done it herself, preemptively, the week after the announcement, before a single round of treatment had even been scheduled. I want to beat it to the punch, she said, and everyone cried, and I have to hand it to her, even now, it was the single most convincing thing she ever did. You look at a shaved head and your body believes before your brain even gets a vote. Her church, we weren't church-going, exactly, but Desmond's was, and it had absorbed Wren the way churches absorb the beloved fiancés of their sons, started a fund. Bake sales. A spaghetti dinner that raised $1,100 in one evening. A widower 2 pews back who quietly signed over his fishing boat deposit. Casseroles stacked in my parents' chest freezer in labeled layers, like sediment. My mother cut her hospice hours to part-time. My father started saying even fewer words than usual, which I hadn't known was possible. And I drove every Wednesday, and watched my sister walk through the sliding glass doors of that clinic with her chin up, and some weeks, against her explicit instructions, I sat in the visitor lot anyway, telling myself I stayed to be nearby in case something went wrong, knowing, somewhere below the telling, that something in me was keeping watch. I'd like to claim it was purely love. It was partly love. But I check things for a living, and some kind of checking runs below the surface like a pilot light. All that fall it burned low in me, and I fed it nothing, and it would not go out. The first real crack was made of paper, because in my life, everything important eventually arrives as paper. Late October, a Wednesday. I dropped Wren at the main entrance as instructed, then, because it was raining and I wanted coffee and had case files to read, I parked anyway and slipped in through the side lobby to the little cafe attached to the clinic building. I told myself I was staying nearby in case of emergency. I nursed a coffee, read through fraud case summaries for an evening class, and lost track of time until my phone buzzed. Done early today. Easy session. Where are you? 22 minutes. That's what the parking garage ticket printed when the machine spat it back at me on my way out to get the car. 22 minutes, gate to gate, for a session she'd described to us, in loving 4-hour detail, more times than I could count. In the car, she was bright, chatty, scarf knotted precisely where hair used to be, narrating her easy session, which nurse, which chair, the little cups of apple juice they handed out afterward, and I drove and nodded and felt each detail land wrong, one at a time, like checks drawn on an account I suddenly needed to see the balance of. Easy sessions exist, I told myself. Schedules change. Maybe it was just blood work. Maybe a consult. I gave her every benefit of the doubt a good analyst gives a document before flagging it for review. But that night, alone in my apartment, I did the thing I can't take back. I flattened that parking receipt on my kitchen counter, photographed it, and slid the photograph into a folder on my laptop. If you've ever prayed you were wrong about someone you love and kept the receipt anyway, you already know the exact, specific shame of that particular Tuesday night. At work, I open a file when I believe a claim deserves testing. I opened this one praying I would get to close it. The folder had other plans. 2 weeks later, during what our family calendar had labeled her heavy chemo week, I stopped by Wren and Desmond's apartment with a container of the bone broth she'd told us was the only thing she could keep down. Desmond's car was gone. Through the front window, before I'd even knocked, I saw my dying sister seated at the kitchen island, laughing into her phone, working her way through a takeout container of pad CEW, the kind she always ordered extra spicy, the kind that had once, famously, made Desmond cry at a food court. Her scarf was off. Her scalp shone, freshly maintained, under the pendant light. I stood on the walkway with my little container of broth going lukewarm in my hands and watched my sister be completely, radiantly fine. Then I knocked, and by the time she opened the door, the noodles were gone, the scarf was back, and her voice had dropped into the register the whole family now recognized as brave. "You're an angel. I probably can't keep anything down today." "Light day," she said. "New anti-nausea medication," she said. There was an answer for everything. There always was. The file at work with an answer for everything is the file I pull first. I drove home, sat at my counter, and added a line to my folder in plain, factual language. Date. Time. What I saw. No adjectives. Then I closed the file and put my hand flat on top of my laptop, the way you'd quiet a heartbeat. Some files, once you open them, start keeping you. In January, the money moved, and this is the part where I stop being able to tell myself I'm overreacting. My parents had a fund, $12,000 saved slow, over a decade, promised to me years earlier as help for first-year city living costs. My mother told me it was being redirected the way you'd mention a schedule change while unloading a dishwasher. I could hear the plates clinking behind her voice. "We're putting it toward Wren's supplemental care. There's a retreat program in Sedona her support group swears by, integrative therapies, the insurance won't touch it, of course you understand." And then, into my silence, the sentence again, warm as a heating pad, "You'll land on your feet, honey. You always do." I stood in my kitchen listening to plates clink into a drying rack, and for the first time in my life I heard that sentence with the wrapping off. It wasn't a compliment. It was an invoice, marked paid in advance. I was the daughter whose feet were the family's collateral. Wren was the daughter whose falls the family existed to catch. And a wellness retreat in the Red Rocks of Arizona was about to consume my entire first-year housing budget on the strength of a diagnosis I could not verify through a single named, licensed physician. I said something small and agreeable, because 30 years of training doesn't dissolve in one phone call. Then I hung up, opened my file, and turned to a fresh page. Here's what I knew by then, in my bones if not yet in evidence: grief spends money forward, toward treatment and survival. Fraud spends money sideways, into things with spas. My mother mentioned, almost approvingly, that Wren had saved money by booking the retreat's non-refundable tier, proof, she said, of fighting spirit. People who are actually dying rarely gamble on their own attendance at anything 8 weeks out. Wren never once missed a payment. Or a pedicure. I want to be precise about what I did next, because how you find a truth matters almost as much as the truth itself. I didn't hack anything, didn't steal a document or record a private call. I did what I do at my desk every working day of my life. I read what was already public, slowly, twice. The church fund had an online page, and the page had photo updates, captioned things like "Fight Day," "My sister in a recliner," "Scarf on," "Brave thumbs up," and 4-line taped along her forearm. I'd scrolled past that photo a dozen times on my phone, the way everyone else in the congregation had. That night, I opened it on my laptop, full screen, the way I open an exhibit at work. The taped line stopped exactly at the tape. No catheter beneath it. No hub. No port. Just clear tubing laid flat against skin, taped down like a costume wearing a costume. I zoomed out. On her wrist, a hospital admission band. I zoomed in. Half the print was worn illegible, but the date wasn't, an admission from nearly 3 years back. Long before the diagnosis. Long before any of this. She'd kept it. She'd kept an old hospital band from an unrelated visit and worn it as a prop, and the prop was now load-bearing for over $17,000 of other people's grocery money. I sat back from the laptop and the room went very quiet, the particular quiet that follows a verdict. There's a thing that happens in my chest when a file confesses. A cold click, like a lock deciding. I'd felt it at work a dozen times, and it had always felt like winning. This time it felt like watching a door close on a house I grew up inside. I printed both photographs, marked them the way I mark exhibits, and slid them behind the receipts. The folder was becoming a case. And cases, in my experience, do not stay quietly in drawers forever. The following Wednesday, I finally did the thing I'd been refusing to do for months. I dropped Wren at the main entrance, watched her walk in with her chin up, then, instead of driving home, pulled into the visitor lot and waited, eyes on the side exit, hating myself in a calm, organized way that felt worse than hot anger would have. 25 minutes. That's how long my sister spent inside a cancer treatment center on an infusion Wednesday. At minute 25, she came out the side door in sunglasses, scarf off, moving like a woman between errands, and got into Desmond's gray sedan, idling at the curb the entire time. They pulled away laughing at something I'll never know the punchline of. I didn't follow them. I didn't take a photograph. It would have proven nothing. A woman is allowed to leave a building. I sat with my hands at 10 and 2, as if I were still driving somewhere, and understood, finally, that there had never been a Wednesday. Not one. The chair, the nurse, the little paper cups of juice, she had built a set and furnished it weekly with detail, and cast me, for 13 months, as the transportation department of a play I hadn't known I was in. Desmond turned out to be a casualty too, not a co-conspirator, a man who genuinely believed he was ferrying his fiancée from a lymphatic infusion to lunch. Just another audience member with a better seat than mine. I drove home well under the speed limit, which for me is a 5-alarm symptom. At my counter, I wrote the date and 2 lines, no adjectives, and closed the file. Then I opened it again and counted what I had: 9 parking receipts, 2 photographs, 1 worn hospital band, 0 doctors. What I still didn't have was the one piece that couldn't be explained away by a private, tired woman keeping her medical business to herself. I needed a name. Before I tell you how I got the name, I have to tell you about the summer I was 8, because it's the only way any of this makes the kind of sense that keeps you human instead of merely right. My father told me this story on the back porch one February night, both of us in coats, him holding a beer he never actually drank. Wren was 12. She'd gone off a rope swing at the quarry sideways and caught the shallow shelf instead of open water, a bad break, surgery, pins, a cast from wrist to elbow, though the story had grown in the family telling until it sometimes sounded like a whole summer's injury instead of the 6 weeks it actually was. My mother, who had never in living memory taken more than 3 consecutive sick days, took the better part of that summer off, unpaid. She set up a cot in Wren's room. She read her the entirety of a fantasy series Wren had been meaning to get to, chapter by chapter, and charted her pain like a patient she was finally, fully allowed to love out loud, on the record, in front of everyone. I was 8. I spent that summer at my grandmother's house 2 towns over, and I remember it, now, as the summer I learned to make my own sandwiches. I remember being proud of that. Proud. You see it, don't you? My father looked out at the yard he'd mowed for 30 years and said the part he'd apparently carried, unspoken, for 2 decades, the day the cast came off, your sister cried like somebody died. I thought it was the pain, Noor. Took me a long time to understand she was crying because summer was over. 2 little girls. 1 house. 1 exhausted, capable woman doing crisis triage at a hospice all week and then coming home to do it again, for free, for love, for whichever daughter needed her more that particular hour. Wren learned that broken gets you loved out loud. I learned that whole gets you left at your grandmother's with a jar of peanut butter and your own good judgment. I called being left alone independence, and I built an entire adult life on top of that word, And I want to be extremely clear about something before we go further. I am not excusing what my sister did. I am telling you where the disease actually started, because it was never, not for one single day, in her lymph nodes. It started in a house that only had one working alarm bell, and both of us learned, at different ages and by different means, exactly how to ring it. By March, the folder was complete except for one tab, and it had outgrown my kitchen drawer, or maybe I'd simply stopped being able to eat breakfast next to it. It was an accordion folder by then, a dozen dividers, receipts sleeved in date order, photographs sleeved separately, my notes typed because my own handwriting had started to feel too intimate for what the pages contained. I'd labeled the last empty tab physician, and it sat there like a missing tooth I kept running my tongue over. I did something then I've never told anyone before now. I put the folder in the trunk of my car, under the spare tire, and drove around with it there for 11 days, to work, to Sunday dinner, to the pharmacy, merging onto the interstate with what felt like a live grenade under my spare, checking my mirrors as if the truth itself might be following me. I couldn't bring it into my parents' house, and I couldn't bring it back into my own apartment either. So it lived, for those 11 days, in the one space I owned that no one else ever thought to ask about. Those 11 days, I understand now, were me giving my sister 11 more chances to actually be dying. Meanwhile, the clock I'd been trying to ignore started chiming louder. June 1st, my enrollment deadline, the hard edge of the one-year deferral, was 10 weeks out, and my mother had started saying things like obviously fall is impossible in the exact settled tone she used for the care plan. Another year, she meant, except there was no another year. There was only forfeit and reapply, funding not guaranteed. When I explained the actual policy, my mother looked at me the way you look at someone doing arithmetic at a funeral. And Wren, from the couch, said gently, "It's okay, Mom. Noor's plans have always been portable." I drove home that night with the folder humming under the spare tire like a second engine. 10 weeks. One empty tab. And a sister who had just, very softly, called my entire life a suitcase. The wedding, Wren and Desmond's, long planned for the following spring, got moved up that March. Because time isn't guaranteed, Wren told the family, and the family wept and nodded, and the church added a second fundraiser dinner to help the young couple marry before the Lord called her home. People believed it because believing it made them decent, and con artists eat decency for fuel. That isn't the church's fault, or the widower's, it will never be anyone's fault but hers, and, in some smaller way, ours, for building a house where this was the only currency that ever bought attention. Wren asked me to be her maid of honor in front of the entire family, the only way she ever asked me for anything, publicly, so refusal would cost more than compliance. One Saturday, I stood in a bridal shop holding fabric swatches while my dying sister tried on gowns and glowed under 3 attendants who'd been quietly briefed on her story and treated the fitting like a small act of ministry. In the mirror, flushed with all that borrowed light, Wren said the thing I think about more than almost anything else in this entire account. She was looking at herself, not at me. "You have your whole future, Noor. All I have is this year. The year everybody finally sees me." She said it lightly, like a joke about the champagne. The fitting room went 1 second too quiet, the way a room does when a witness answers a question nobody actually asked. Then an attendant laughed kindly and the moment closed back over like water. But I'd heard it. Not a confession, she was too fluent for that. More like the accounting behind the entire production, glimpsed for one blink through an open ledger she hadn't meant to leave lying out. This year everybody finally sees me. Not this year I'm sick. Not this year I'm dying. Just, seen. That was the actual product she'd been buying, this whole time, with all of it, the shaved head, the taped tubing, the little paper cups of juice. Seen, at market rate, with my year as part of the currency. I zipped her into the next gown, and my hands were perfectly steady. And that's when I knew the folder was coming out from under the spare tire. I tried my father first, because he was the closest thing our family had to neutral ground. Porch again. Coats again. I didn't show him the folder that night. I led with one gentle, testable fact, the way you test a witness before you put the exhibits in front of them. She's never once given us the actual name of her doctor. A whole year, Dad. Doesn't that strike you as strange? My father, who I had watched shrink an inch over the course of that year, didn't look surprised. That was the terrible part. He looked out at the yard he'd mowed for 30 years, and his jaw worked, and what he finally said, very quietly, was this: "Don't make your mother choose, Noor. I'm asking you. Please. Because she won't pick you." There it is. The sentence that still lives somewhere under my ribs. Not she'd never believe it. Not you're wrong. My father had run the numbers long before I had, maybe years before, and had chosen the only survival strategy he understood, which was to keep the household weather calm and love both of us from inside his own silence. The one person in that family who suspected exactly what I suspected was begging me to help him keep not knowing it out loud. I looked at him and understood that if I put the folder on the table, I'd be doing it without a single ally in the room, and my mother's first instinct wouldn't be to read it. It would be to find out who had hurt her bleeding daughter. And it would be me. That night I understood the true cost sheet. Telling would cost me my mother. Not telling had a price too. It was being built, quietly, dollar by dollar, to a church full of people, and to a version of myself I was starting not to recognize in the mirror. What finally ended the swallowing wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. The second fundraiser had a printed goal, 10,000 more, for experimental options out of state. I sat in a folding chair at Sunday dinner and did the sum I'd been refusing to do out loud: 17,400 already given, 10,000 more solicited, my parents 12, my deferred year unpriceable, every dollar raised on a diagnosis whose only supporting document was a shaved head and a costume made of medical tape. I got the name, in the end, by being family, which is its own kind of confession. Sunday dinner, dessert, everyone soft with pie. I asked it as logistics, not challenge. For the retreat forms, who should Mom list as your primary oncologist, just so everything matches up? No edge. Clipboard voice. Wren, deep in the ease of 13 unquestioned months, answered on autopilot, reaching for her coffee. A name. Tossed off like pocket change. My mother wrote it on her legal pad, grateful for something concrete to record. Dinner rolled on. I sat with my pie and my racing heart, because I knew something the rest of the table didn't: physician licenses are public record. Every state runs a searchable database. Anyone can check. Almost no one ever does. That night, at my kitchen counter, I typed the name into 3 neighboring states' licensing databases. No results. I widened the spelling. Nothing. I widened the specialty. Nothing. As far as any public record showed, there was no physician by that name licensed to practice medicine within 200 miles of us. I printed the empty search screen at 1 in the morning, the saddest exhibit I've ever sleeved into a folder, and sat in my kitchen while 13 months finished quietly rearranging themselves into their true shape. Then I did the last decent thing I could think of. I drove to Wren's apartment the next evening, while Desmond was still at work, set a single parking receipt on her kitchen counter, and said, 48 hours. Tell Mom and Dad the truth yourself, whatever the truth actually is, or I show them what I have. My sister looked at that small paper rectangle, and I watched the entire performance drain out of her face like water finding a crack in a foundation. For about 5 seconds, I met the person underneath. Dry-eyed. Level. Almost bored. Sick beats smart in this house, she said. It always has. Then the mask slid back into place, and she asked if I wanted tea. She didn't use the 48 hours to confess. She used them to reload. Hour 40. A Tuesday evening. My phone lit up with the family group text: Wren has news. Everyone at Mom and Dad's, 7 p.m. I drove over with the folder in my trunk and my heart going like a payroll clerk at closing, because I already knew. You learn a person's moves after a year of cataloging them. We assembled in the good living room, Desmond behind her chair, my mother already reaching for her hand, and my sister looked around at her audience and told them it had spread to her spine. Paralysis risk within the month. A specialist in Houston who'd agreed to take her as a courtesy case. There were sounds in that room I will hear for the rest of my life. My mother made one of them. And through it all, Wren's eyes found mine for less than a second, and there was nothing in them that matched her voice. I understood the message, because it was addressed to me alone. Your move was never going to matter. Escalation as armor. A spinal lesion to make any accusation unspeakable, because who interrogates a woman who might be paralyzed by Friday? And if her details wobbled now, well, that's the lesions talking. It was, and I say this with the specific horror of a professional both admiring and opposing the filing, airtight. The second benefit dinner got moved up again. A cousin started a prayer chain. My mother began researching out-of-state clinical trials on her phone before the meeting had fully broken up. I hugged my sister goodbye like everyone else, her scarf smelling like the same green apple shampoo, and she whispered, close to my ear, "Thank you for coming." 48 hours I had given her. She'd spent them building a fortress out of my family's love. Thursday night, I called my parents and asked for the two of them and Wren. No Desmond. At the kitchen table, not the living room, the kitchen, where in our family the facts have always actually lived, between the bills and the salt. I laid the folder out the way I've watched attorneys do it for years. No speech. One exhibit at a time. 9 parking stamps in date order, gate to gate, none longer than 40 minutes across 13 months of supposedly 4-hour infusions. The fundraiser photograph, full resolution, tubing taped to nothing. The hospital wristband, enlarged, its admission date nearly 3 years old. And last, the printout, physician license lookup, every spelling, every specialty, every bordering state. No results found. My mother fought it exactly the way you'd expect a good, careful nurse-adjacent woman to fight it. She went technical. Parking machines misprint. Photographs compress badly online. Private clinics build their equipment differently than she's used to seeing. Databases lag behind real filings. She stood at her own counter cross-examining paper, because paper can be wrong and daughters, in her worldview, cannot. My father sat with one hand flat over the parking receipts, not moving, as if he were keeping them warm. I asked the only question I had rehearsed, not to my mother, to Wren, who had gone very still. What are you taking? Not the protocol. Name one drug, from your own bathroom cabinet, that I can go look at right now. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a car went by with its radio on. My mother turned to her oldest daughter, expecting the answer that would put me back in my place. My sister looked at the empty, bottleless kitchen of her 34 years and began, very quietly, to come apart. Not the movie version, one clean confession with music underneath. It came apart in strips. First anger, how dare I, jealous, jealous, jealous. Then bargaining, the doctor was real but out of network, the treatments were real but holistic, the money was mostly still there somewhere. Then, when each strip hit the table and died next to the exhibits, quieter and quieter, until what was left standing in my parents' kitchen wasn't the dying swan and wasn't the golden bride, but a 34-year-old woman shaking in a way no audience had ever been meant to see. And she said the only fully true sentence I'd heard from her in 13 months. At least when I'm sick, Mom actually looks at me. I watched those words hit my mother like weather hitting glass. And then I watched my mother do the thing I had known, since that February night on the porch, that she would do. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around Wren, around the liar, the architect of all of it, and held her shaking daughter with 30 years of trained hands. And over Wren's shoulder, my mother's eyes found me, standing by my folder. My beautiful, accurate, worthless folder. What did you do? She said. Not to Wren. To me. I want to tell you I said something equal to the moment. What I actually did was gather my exhibits, square their edges the way I do when my hands need instructions, and say very quietly the sentence I'd apparently been carrying my whole life without knowing it. I land on my feet, Mom, because nobody in this family has ever once tried to catch me. Then I walked out of the warm kitchen into the cold car, and the collapse began without me. Here is what 13 months of performance costs, once the curtain rips. I've made a habit of itemizing things, it's how my hands stay steady. That same night, Wren went into crisis. A real one. The first real one. I won't put the specifics of it online, except to say that my mother, recognizing danger with a hospice nurse's eyes even through her own devastation, drove her to the emergency room herself. This time the hospital band she left with had the correct date on it. She was evaluated, kept safe, and within the week entered a residential treatment program voluntarily, 90 days. A doctor whose name I will actually print here, because he was real and because his diagnosis mattered, Dr. Amare Feld, eventually gave the thing its clinical name, a factitious disorder, sitting on top of a depression that had, it turned out, been quietly running the projector for the better part of a decade. Desmond learned everything on a Thursday and was gone by Sunday. The ring came back to my parents by registered mail, the most Desmond sentence I could construct if I tried for a year. My father told the church the truth himself. I didn't know he had that courage in him, and I don't think he did either, until the moment he needed it, and my parents promised full repayment of the $17,400, eventually raised by borrowing against a house they'd owned outright for 30 years. No charges were filed. Small towns bury their own embarrassments deeper than they bury their dead. And me, the person who had said the true thing, with receipts, I became, in the family's unofficial oral history, the night everything happened. Not the lie. The telling. My mother didn't speak to me for 11 days. When she finally did, it was one sentence, left on my voicemail, tired as the end of a double shift. You did it in one evening, Noor. I have to fix it for years. I enrolled on time. Deposit paid on May 30th, 2 days inside the deadline, from my phone, in a grocery store parking lot, because that's exactly where I happened to be standing when I finally stopped waiting for anyone's permission. In August I packed my apartment into a rental van that nobody helped me load, put the acceptance letter and its little adding machine magnet in the cup holder, and drove 14 hours east to Chicago with the radio off the entire way. I had one. I need you to sit with how completely I had one. The seat, the funding, the truth on the record, the fraud stopped, the donors reimbursed to the last dollar. And I have never in my life felt anything as quiet, or as hollow, as that first semester. I studied in the library until it closed most nights, because my studio apartment had one chair and no good light, and some evenings, walking home past lit restaurant windows, I'd catch myself rehearsing, not case law, but the kitchen table, refining what I'd said, adding what I should have said instead, in the courtroom that had set up permanent residence behind my eyes, where the trial, it turned out, never actually adjourned. That's the part nobody warns you about when they hand you the truth and tell you it will set you free. Being right, it turns out, is a meal that doesn't keep you full for very long at all. The Christmas cards that first year were signed Mom and Dad in my father's handwriting. He called every month, from his shop's parking lot on his lunch break, machines running behind him, and we talked about coursework and tomato plants and never once about the thing itself. I understood those calls were being made from the driveway of his marriage, and I loved him for making them anyway, and I let that be enough, because it had to be. Wren wrote to me once, about a year in. By then she was out of the residential program and well into the long, unglamorous stretch of outpatient care. Tuesdays, my father reported, every single week, without a single gap. The envelope arrived at my apartment in handwriting I would have known anywhere in the world, and I did not open it. I told myself I'd read it when I was ready, and then I moved it from the counter to a drawer, and from the drawer to a shoebox, the way you move a thing you can neither keep looking at nor bring yourself to throw away. It rode with me to a second apartment, still unopened, at the end of my second year. On moving day the shoebox tipped, and the envelope slid out onto the bare floor and lay there in the afternoon light, as if it had chosen its moment. I sat down on an overturned milk crate and finally opened it. It was not what I'd braced myself for. No excuses. No relitigating the kitchen table. No request to meet. It was, of all things, an accounting. She had apparently learned to itemize too. Somewhere in all those Tuesdays, she had listed, plainly, what she had taken from me, the year, the $12,000, the wedding I would have attended as a sister instead of watching from a life already 3 states away, the mother I had walked out of that kitchen without. What she had taken from the church, she wrote, was being repaid now, down to the widower's fishing boat deposit, from a job she'd found at a garden nursery of all places. And then, at the bottom, one line alone on its own page, with no punctuation to soften it. Nobody ever really looked at me until something was killing me. So I made the something up. And then it almost was. I read that line until the light in the apartment changed color. I didn't write back. But I kept the letter, and for the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly where it was. Which brings us back to that rainy Tuesday last fall. 9:40 at night. Me at my little desk, 3 years into the program by then, 7 months from a diploma with my own name on it, outlining for a seminar I'd stopped fully paying attention to somewhere around page 4. The buzzer rang, not the lobby buzzer, my actual apartment door, which meant a neighbor had let someone in downstairs, which meant somebody had already stood on the sidewalk in the rain, working up the nerve to press a stranger's button first. I looked through the peephole and felt my entire bloodstream change direction. Wren. Hair grown back past her ears, dark at the roots, real. No makeup. A raincoat gone thin and translucent at the shoulders from the weather, and under her arm, held the way you hold something you've rehearsed holding, a familiar maroon shape I couldn't place for a second, and then could. She'd brought something with her. She stood there without knocking, and I stood on my side of the door without opening it, 2 sisters separated by 1.5 inches of hollow core wood and 2 full years of silence. I did the thing I do. I inventoried. The Tuesdays my father reported. The nursery job she'd held longer, I realized, than any job of her adult life. The repayment installments. The letter still sitting in a drawer in the next room. Then she knocked, twice, softly, and I heard her breathe in through the door before she'd even confirmed I was home. Noor. It's me. I'm not here to ask you to forget anything. I came to ask if you think we can ever be sisters again. That's the whole question. You can just say no through the door if that's easier for you. My hand was already on the knob, and every version of myself I had ever been, the easy one, the driver, the analyst, the plaintiff, put their hands on it too. I opened the door. Not wide. The width of a conversation, my palm still braced against the frame. The hallway light in my building runs a weak, tea-colored yellow, and my sister stood inside it looking older than 34 and, somehow, more like herself than I had ever once seen her, if that makes any sense at all. Like a photograph that had finally been developed correctly, after years of coming back overexposed. Up close I could see the rain hadn't spared the folder tucked under her arm. She noticed me noticing and held it a little tighter, and neither of us said anything about it yet. Hi, she said. Hi, I said. Groundbreaking material. We come, both of us, from a long line of people who narrate everything except the thing that actually matters. She squared up the way you do at a podium, and I could tell the whole speech was rehearsed, and I could also tell it kept collapsing on her midline, which is exactly how I knew it was real. Rehearsed real stutters. Performed real never does. I'd spent 13 months at 40 miles an hour every Wednesday learning the precise difference. I'm 2.5 years into treatment, she said. Every Tuesday. I work at a nursery, plants, not babies, before you ask. I pay mom and dad back on the 1st of every month, and it's small, and it's slow, and I'm not fixed. Dr. Feld says fixed isn't really the word for it, and I've stopped shopping around for a better one. Her chin did something complicated. I didn't come here to ask you to forget, and I didn't come to perform being well for you either. I came because there's a version of the rest of our lives where you and I are just 2 women who happen to share a mother and a Christmas card list. And before I let that be the answer, I had to stand here and actually ask you, out loud, to your face. Do you think we can ever be sisters again? Rain ticked against the hallway window. Somewhere below us, a neighbor's television laughed at something. And in my chest, quietly, a document I knew by heart began to recite itself from memory. I should tell you I had a speech ready. I'd been drafting it for 2 years without admitting that's what I was doing, in the library, in the shower, at red lights on the drive home from campus. My closing argument. It had sections. The year I lost, itemized. The mother I lost, exhibit by exhibit. The bridal shop mirror, the side exit, the 22 minutes. It was airtight and, I believed, unanswerable, and standing in that doorway with her question hanging in the tea-colored light, I felt it queue up in my chest like an entire career's worth of work finally called to trial. And then I looked down at her hands. She was holding that ruined maroon folder the way a 12-year-old holds a cast, like the very thing that had hurt her was also, somehow, the only proof she had that she'd ever mattered at all. And the first line of my closing argument simply dissolved on my tongue, because I suddenly saw the whole courtroom for exactly what it was. 2 years I had lived inside that trial. 2 years of being the wronged one, the right one, the one holding the receipts. And it had kept me exactly as seen, exactly as fed, as Wren's waiting rooms had ever kept her. Different currency. Same starving economy. She had bought attention with wounds. I had bought worth with grievance. We were both, it turned out, still our mother's daughters, both of us billing the world for love in the only denominations either of us had ever been issued. So instead of the speech, I asked my 2 questions. The only due diligence that still mattered. Are you still in treatment? Every Tuesday. 2.5 years. No gaps. Who knows you're here tonight? And my sister, who had never in her entire life done anything without an audience, who had gotten engaged mid-birthday cake and diagnosed herself into a full congregation, looked at me in a dim hallway with rain still in her hair and said, "Nobody. This one couldn't have witnesses." That was sort of the point. That answer, more than any apology she could have written or rehearsed or performed, is what finally moved my hand off the doorframe. "Wait here," I said, which are apparently the exact words I say at the moment my old life ends. I went to the closet and, from the bottom of a box I hadn't fully unpacked in 2 moves, took out my own maroon accordion folder, 9 parking stamps, 2 photographs, 1 worn hospital band, 1 printout that says no results found. I carried it back to the door and watched my sister recognize it and go pale. She thought, I could tell, that I was about to read the charges out loud one final time. Honestly, some old prosecutor in me thought so too, right up until the moment my hands decided otherwise. Instead I held it out to her, flat, on both palms, the way you return something to its rightful owner. "Trade," I said. She didn't move. "You asked if we can ever be sisters again," I said, and my voice came out level, the register I'd waited 2 years to hear from myself again. "The answer is no. Not the way you mean it. The sisters we were died at that kitchen table. And Wren, they should have. One of them was performing sick, and the other one was performing fine, and neither of us had told the truth at that table since we were kids." Her chin came up. She didn't argue. "So here's what I can offer instead. First Saturday of every month, there's a coffee place on my corner. 1 hour, public table, 1 rule. We tell the truth. Small truths count. Bad truths count double. The first time either of us performs anything at all, for each other, for Mom, for ourselves, we're done. And I mean forever done. That's the whole offer. It isn't sisters again. It's sisters from scratch." She was crying by then, the unphotogenic kind, the kind with no cameras in it anywhere, no audience, no lighting. "This is yours to carry now," I said, and put the folder into her free hand. I've had it memorized for 2 years. The year, the money, the church, the lie, I could recite it in my sleep, Wren, and that's the problem. I have been. You told me once, sick beats smart in this house. Maybe it always did. But I've learned something they never taught us at that kitchen table. Truth beats sick. It's the only thing that actually has. Somebody just has to be willing to go first. I'm going first, I said. I'm done being the clerk of your record. Carry your own file, or burn it in a garden somewhere. I honestly don't care anymore. It's off my shelf. My sister took the folder, the entire weight of her own history onto the same arm already holding the one she'd brought through the rain. Then she held out what she'd carried, and I took it, still not knowing what was inside. We stood there in the weak yellow light, having traded evidence like two exhausted nations exchanging prisoners at the end of a long war. She put out her hand. In 29 years, my sister and I had hugged for cameras and cried for congregations, but we had never once simply shaken hands. We shook hands. Her grip was terrible, and shaking, and completely real. "First Saturday," she said. "First Saturday," I said, and closed the door softly all the way, and stood with my palm flat against it, listening to my sister's footsteps go back down the stairs, lighter, I thought, than they'd come up. I sat down in my one good chair and finally opened what my sister had carried through the rain. Inside, a repayment ledger, handwritten, every installment to our parents dated and initialed, months and months of them, the running balance shrinking line by line in her round, careful, schoolgirl numbers. A letter from Dr. Feld's outpatient program, not private records, just a plain certificate of completion, the kind of thing you'd frame if your life had gone a little differently. A photograph I'd never once seen before, the two of us at maybe 6 and 9 in our grandmother's backyard, me riding piggyback, both of us mid-laugh, taken before either of us had learned a single one of our respective lessons. And at the very bottom, in an envelope with my name on it, for $100 in money orders and one line, in her handwriting, "First installment of what I owe you. It will take a while." That's rather the point. I sat there a long time with the rain still going outside, my hand pressed over my mouth. Then I cried, the short, violent, efficient kind, mostly release valve. And when it passed, I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, exactly what had actually left my body. It wasn't Wren. It was the case. 2 years of carrying a private, unfiled prosecution everywhere I went, and the whole file had just walked back down my stairs under someone else's arm, right where it should have been the entire time. I texted my father one line before bed. "She came by. I'm okay. Call you tomorrow." And for the first time in 2 years, okay wasn't testimony. It was just the truth, small, and a little bad, and free, and entirely mine. It's been 6 months of First Saturdays now, so you should have the full accounting, since I'm apparently constitutionally incapable of leaving anything unitemized. The first coffee lasted 40 minutes, and I'd estimate 31 of them were silence, working silence, the kind two people sit inside side by side, not the kind they aim at each other like a weapon. By the third Saturday she told me, plainly, what the residential program had actually been like, the group sessions, the roommate who snored, the counselor who finally got her to say the thing about the broken wrist out loud for the first time. I told her, in turn, what the university library looks like at 2 in the morning, smaller and lonelier than either of us had apparently been imagining it. We discovered, somewhere in month 3, that we'd both spent our years hiding inside institutions with unusually good overhead lighting. In March, she texted me on a Friday night, "Can't make tomorrow. Migraine." And then, 10 minutes later, before I'd even had a chance to respond, that was a lie. No migraine. I'm scared of this month's conversation, that's the actual bad truth. Rule's the rule. Your call whether we're still doing this. I sat with my phone for a long while before I answered, and then I wrote back the sentence I think might genuinely be the hinge of this entire story, more than the folder, more than the door. A confessed lie still counts as a truth. That's how the math works now. See you next month. She was there. First table by the window, same as always, 20 minutes early, which I've since learned is new for her too. My mother and I are slower, and I've made a kind of peace with that. She came down in April, and we had lunch, and she talked, haltingly, about the therapist she and my father have started seeing together, my father's idea, the bravest sentence of his entire life, in my estimation. In the car afterward, staring through the windshield instead of at me, she said one thing and didn't elaborate. I should have pulled the records myself. I'm a nurse. I know how to read a chart. I just didn't want to. Not an apology, exactly. But I've stopped billing people for everything, all at once, on demand. That interest had been eating me alive for 2 straight years, and I finally understand some debts only ever get paid in installments, on the first of the month, in small round numbers, for a very long time. Wren is still at the nursery. She got promoted this spring to the perennial section, which she told me, completely deadpan, is the correct section for people learning to come back reliably every single year. The installments still arrive on the first, hers to our parents, hers to me, 2 separate debts shrinking at their own separate rates. On my desk, next to the diploma frame that finally has something in it, there's an old adding machine that used to sit on my grandfather's hardware store counter, holding nothing up but itself now. Some Saturdays, on my way out the door to coffee, I run my thumb across the keys for luck, the way you'd flick a coin. I used to think forgiveness meant reopening the old set of books and simply agreeing, out loud, to stop noticing that the columns had never once balanced. I know better now. It can be smaller than that, and a great deal sturdier. A new ledger, opened fresh, with exactly one honest rule keeping the columns straight, and the only key to it sitting in my own pocket, right where, I've come to understand, it should have been all along. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know what family this quiet, and what silence this loud, actually costs, and what it takes to finally break it. Tell me in the comments, could you have opened that door? And if a story like this one found you tonight, you know what to do, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.